Welcome to Forging Plowshares, a community dedicated to cultivating the peaceful kingdom of God. We hope this part of our ongoing conversation stimulates your mind and challenges your heart about what it means to be a follower of Jesus. Please stay tuned at the end of the podcast for a short message about our ministry.
In this final episode, Trent Maxey of Amhurst College, who has written the book, The Greatest Problem on Religion in Japan, talks about the role of Shinto and its kind of ambiguity in the Meiji Restoration, and actually the invention of the religion or invention of Shinto, not as a religion, in fact, but as a kind of state ideology. And so the role it plays in Meiji and even up to modern Japan and understanding the role of the emperor gets at the ambiguity of religion and the category itself and the interplay between Buddhism and Shinto and the way that that has worked itself out in relationship to the political system and to the culture, I think is quite fascinating. If you enjoy these conversations and you would like to hear more of them, we encourage you to support Forging Plowshares, to like us on social media. If you're able to take a class with Plowshares Bible Institute, perhaps join one of our book clubs. We have a book club coming up on men and their role in the home. We also then have a course coming up taught by Michael Harden on Rene Girard. If you're able to donate, we encourage you to do that. You can see how to do that on our website, either through Outreach International or on our Patreon page. So hope you enjoy this final episode, this final installment with Dr. Trent Maxey. Hey, Trent!
Greetings.
Hey, good to see you.
I got to confess, I'm pretty fried today.
Oh, I bet. Is one of your first day of classes?
Well, I'd say we're in week 2, but Thursday is 2 classes, office hours, and we're doing a job search right now. So it then had a job talk at the end of the day. So you can quiz me about Byzantine blinding punishments.
Oh, that's an unusual specialty.
No, it was actually quite good. Apparently, it was quite the big deal. They like blinding people in Byzantium.
Oh, and this is this person's scholarly specialty?
Harvard PhD, Princeton postdoc.
You can't get any more impressive than that.
No, he made it pretty interesting. Part of it was kind of the tracing this stereotype of Byzantium, and apparently this blinding stuff gets a lot of press into the early modern era. And so he was kind of doing a kind of fairly detailed look at what does it tell you about sovereignty and power, and like only the emperor could commute a death penalty into a blinding.
So it was a common punishment? Was there a particular
So
reason?
It ebbs and flows. So he's got them all counted up from, the late 6th century to the 14th century. And he's trying to kind of explain. So he's like, everybody thinks of Byzantium as this monolith, but this punishment that gets a lot of play actually has an interesting history to it. And it allows us to say X, Y, Z about the way power and sovereignty worked and so on. So it was a kind of interesting whodunit. But apparently there's precious little material to work with for Byzantium because, the Ottomans burned a lot. So they have to kind of find sources, Greek sources, but also non-Greek sources all around.
The guy's a religion specialist, though.
No, he's a historian and kind of does more. He does archaeology, too. So it's a history position. So we're kind of searching for a kind of medieval / early modernist. So what are we doing tonight? Because I don't know what we're doing.
Hey, you were so impressive on Monday night. I think you can just glow tonight.
Well, you said so. Will there be some overlap, do you think?
There's going to be a different group of people.
Okay.
largely.
Okay.
There's a total of about a dozen people. A guy, he's in Mexico and is now set up in Mexico. He's doing Forging Plowshares Mexico. And he wanted to sit in. And the other person that you already met, David Rawls, he's same situation. He's gone through all the classes. I have a guy that I hope he comes. He's actually a medical doctor. He's an anesthesiologist, but out of the Seventh-day Adventist tradition. Very much probably like me, I'm part of the Christian church, not because there's anybody else in this movement that thinks like I do necessarily.
No, and I often think of the Christian churches in the Midwest, and I think it's probably harder and harder to show up to one and feel like it's really much different from any evangelical church down the road.
It's just they're all the same. They're all the same. Yeah. And actually, I think Christian churches are partly to blame in that we are the ones that promoted church growth philosophy that has now captured all of evangelicalism.
Yeah.
And so they're all doing what the guy in Louisville did.
It was a real kind of moment for me when, it was after Libby and I were married, but it was before I think we moved out here, but we had swung through and visited my Uncle Mark and Aunt Linda in Louisville. And, he had been gone back to being an associate pastor at Shively, but, they wanted to show us around. So, we went to Lexington and, saw the horse farms, but of course we had to go to, is it Southeast, the big one?
Yeah.
And, we drove around and walked in and they showed us the theater style sanctuary and everything. And he was so proud of it, even though it wasn't his church.
Yeah.
And I kept on, so they're growing. And I kept on asking, so where are the people that are growing this church coming from? And of course, if you poke a little bit, they're coming from already existing congregations, right? They're not really reaching anybody. They're just sucking out people absorbing from smaller churches that don't have all the pizzazz.
It's
and
like
I thought, man,
it's the chain store coming in and closing down all the.
Yeah. And, Libby and I always liked the small churches. We kept going to that nominally Methodist church that we were married in. And until, finally people were like, we have to close it down. But, we were down to, 12 of us that would meet every Sunday. And then somehow when the denomination came in, and before we knew it, we got our membership transferred to another Methodist church. So without knowing it, we were officially enrolled as Methodists. But even that other church is pretty rural. And, maybe they had 45 people. So this Episcopal church we've been going to ever since we've been here is the biggest church we've been in. And, they're probably on the membership rolls a couple hundred, but it's not super, it's Episcopal. It doesn't,
Yeah, that's big for an Episcopal church.
Yeah, it is, I think. Around here, it's considered one of the kind of star parishes. It, gets a decent, we have like a pew stacked with retired clergy. So on any given Sunday, you've got like 8 or 9 people who could take over if the first person keels over and dies.
That's comforting.
Yeah.
Hey, Jason.
Hi, guys.
Good to see you.
Hello.
This is Trent.
Yeah, I'm Jason. I just was my first class with Dr. Paul here.
I think Jason heard us. We did. Do you know who David Bentley Hart is, Trent?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, Paul, real quickly as a side note. I see you got a couple of sessions on, and I need to listen to those. Are in my queue next on Douglas Campbell and his doctrine of justification. And
yeah.
Are you a proponent, and is that good stuff?
Yeah, we did a whole class. I just finished the end of last year a class on Romans. We actually used portions of Douglas Campbell's book.
Okay.
And then he has written with a co-author, John Depew.
Yep, I just got that book. I haven't read it, but I just got it. I've seen it in the pipeline, and so I flagged it and stuff. That's supposed to be like a dumbed down version or a stripped down, concise version of his thicker work.
And John shared, they hadn't actually published the book yet, but he shared the galley proofs with us. And so we actually had the book for that class. And so, if you listen to the podcast, I'm going through the arguments for the teacher.
Okay.
Trent, have you ever heard of Douglas Campbell? He's a guy at Duke, and he has this, it sounds a little wild when you first hear it. I've been convinced, to put it in brief, Jason. And Jason, by the way, when I taught this class years back, I still like part of what Douglas Campbell was doing, but I was not at that time convinced by his argument. But now I am. I engage his work more. But his theory, Trent, is that Romans 1:19-32 is actually, Paul is arguing with a false teacher. And this is the expression of the false teacher that Paul is refuting.
Interesting. Is this Liberating Paul's Gospel? Is this what I'm looking? This is his most recent book.
Well, I think if that's strictly Campbell, that's like his big. I don't have that, but the one that he's talking about is that it's Beyond Justification with Douglas Campbell and
yeah, John Dupuy or Dupuy.
The big book, Deliverance of God. And you could tell why a shorter version might be helpful.
Well, as my Jewish colleague would say, you could kill a Gentile with that.
Yeah.
Let me close my door.
I did a couple interviews, Jason, with Douglas Campbell. I don't know that the interviews we got into depth on his theory of the false teacher, but I think we did, pretty good. And then in the class, I'm putting up, if you've been following the podcast I've been putting up, I'm going through the argument. And not everybody in the class was convinced. So, Brian, you were here Monday, I think, were you?
No, I wasn't here. Missed it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I'm Brian Trent. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, I've been taking classes with Paul at Forging Plowshares for a couple of years now. And I heard y'all were just talking about Romans. I can't pull myself away from that study and set of issues and looking at the whole book of Romans. I've had a hard time focusing on this class because I'm still wanting to do Romans.
Hey, Trent, I'm Jonathan Worrell. I live in Rome, Georgia. I'm an anesthesiologist there, and I've kind of lurked around Forging Plowshares for a couple of years and started taking classes last winter, and I've taken a couple. So really enjoyed Paul's approach to thinking about things.
Nice to meet you.
Sure. Good evening. I'm Matt. I am sitting right now in Harrisonburg, Virginia, in the Shenandoah Valley.
Nice.
I am a lawyer by day and interested in theology by night.
He transforms at night.
My tastes get better.
Yeah.
I was there Monday and furiously took notes.
Oh, no.
Wish I was close enough to sit in the back of your classes and pretend I'm not there. It was really good.
Yeah, we
Trent,
like our auditors.
A thing that Jonathan said, Jonathan said he had to take communion to people tonight, but he said after the class, he said, Trent sounds a lot like you.
Gee, I wonder why.
And I said, well, I sound a lot like Trent, maybe. Trent came along. Let me introduce. Trent is my nephew. In no way is he burdened by being related through my bloodline. He's been able to soar because he's got better DNA and genetics. But coming along, I was running a little school in Tokyo, and Trent was doing research at the National Diet, right?
Yeah, Diet Lab, right? Yeah.
And on what became his groundbreaking book on the Meiji Restoration and religion in Japan. And during that time, I entered a PhD program. I think I had.
Yep.
I kind of had a vague idea of what I was doing. And it was about that time that Slavoj Žižek began writing. And so Trent and I several times a week, we would go out and hash all serious problems out. He certainly impacted and influenced me, and even in my choice of how I approached the topic that I did. And since then, he did finish a PhD at Cornell University. He did his undergraduate at Northwestern and is now an august professor at Amhurst College, right? Amhurst.
Correct. Yeah.
Which is, as I understand it, for Japanese studies, is one of the premier colleges in the country.
For curious historical reasons, yes. We do a lot of Japan here. Yeah.
But I'm going to turn it over to Trent, and he's going to build upon where we left off. I hope.
I have to apologize. I'm extra fried today because it's unlike, was it Monday? It was Monday, wasn't it? This is following on a day of classes and office hours and a job talk on corporal punishment in the Byzantine Empire. So I got a lot here. So I thought I could kind of start by talking through a little bit the two pieces I sent along, each very different, and kind of contextualize them a little bit and kind of flesh out why I find them interesting and why I think they're useful in the classrooms where I teach. And so one is excerpts from this book, Shinto, Nature and Ideology in Contemporary Japan by Eike Ratz, who's a Norwegian scholar. What he's doing here is, I think, kind of interesting because on the one hand, he's giving a very specific way for an Anglophone audience to think about, well, what's happening in this place called Japan right now, and how do we talk about something that's grouped together and called Shinto. But I think he's also trying to draw attention to the way, even in seemingly very local, exotic places like Japan, the way these spaces and practices and the way people interact with them are being experienced and described, participate in a kind of global set of trends. So one of the things he observes is, if we roll back the clock 50 years, in Japan, the image of Shinto and Shinto shrines was still very tainted by associations with wartime propaganda in Japan, kind of like a fascist imagery. And then he kind of rolls the kind of camera forward to 2016, when the Japanese prime minister hosted one of these, G20 summits. And as part of that G20 summit, he brings all the heads of state to Ise, which is the kind of considered the holiest shrine because it's the shrine dedicated to the progenitor of the imperial line. And so all of these heads of state, the American president, German chancellor, everybody, they go walk into this shrine with Abe, and there's no kind of sense of political taboo because Shinto's image had changed. And he wants to talk about, well, what allowed this change to happen? And he thinks he uses this idea that there's been a kind of sacralization of Shinto shrines, and that's kind of counterintuitive because we think they're already sacred spaces. But his point is the strategy for sacralizing them was very different. And what's happened is different groups of actors have kind of coalesced around what he calls a Shinto environmentalist paradigm. So instead of thinking about Shinto shrines as a space that connects worshipers to an imperial lineage and so on, Shinto shrines have been like, this is a place where we preserve a untainted connection to nature. So most Shinto shrines in their precincts have a stand of trees, and some precincts are bigger than others, and they have almost forests. And so now the main messaging is what makes Shinto Shinto, and therefore what makes Japan Japan, are these forests. Shinto is a forest religion. It preserves ancient forests. This is why it's a counterpoint to unbridled development and so on and so forth. And so people who normally in Japan would never really do anything at a shrine are now like, oh, it's conservation. Let's go plant trees, or let's go collect acorns, or let's do this, or let's that. And they show up and they participate. And school children will come, and it's a conservation project. It's not religion, but it's still sacralized. And so he's kind of calling it this greenwashing project that's taking place. And what I think is interesting is he's saying this is kind of part of the secularization of Japan, in the sense that almost nobody in Japan answers the question, are you religious, as with yes. Everybody says, I'm not religious. But they're very, very happy to go to shrines. They're very happy to go to temples. They're very happy to get married in churches. So they have some sense of sacredness, but it's not, in their minds, that's not religion. And the Shinto shrines are having to navigate this process. And, you know, one way that it happens is they become what, you know, I think he talks about it in the introductory section I sent along. They become power spots. This is the Japanese phrase for it, power spotto, right? Where you go and you just get the feels. And so, ironically, this kind of resurgence, as it were, this kind of greenwashing of Shinto in Japan that makes Shinto shrines feel more approachable and proximate to a lot of Japanese, has also completely denuded it of any content. It has no content, right? So for stakeholders like Shinto priests and the National Shrine Association, it's a real dilemma for them, because on the one hand, they've really actively supported this greenwashing project, but on the other hand, what they're left with is a fairly contentless relationship to anybody who shows up. So in a kind of secondary point that Rotz points out is, even though the greenwashing campaign is this incredibly narcissistic emphasis that this is about being Japanese, and Japan is a forest civilization, and this is what makes us unique in a materialistic Western-dominated world, et cetera, all of this script about the environment and forests comes out of a kind of 1970s into 1980s neo-paganist movement globally. Right. So there was a kind of movement in kind of coming out of the counterculture in the 60s to say, well, we need to go back to pagan religion in Europe. Right. So you can think about, you know, the kind of revival of Druidism in the UK and so on, that we had a closer connection to nature that's less destructive, and we need to kind of go to a pre-monotheistic exclusivist thing. Blah, blah. And there were academic groups that committed to this. There were international conferences. So the Shinto writers in Japan, they were literally reading and quoting and recycling this. So the whole Shinto environmentalist paradigm is actually international in derivation. It's not a kind of native thing. And so Rotz is kind of pointing out that, okay, so if you even want to drop into a place like Japan that seems strictly homogenous, and we want to talk about its purest native tradition, there's nothing purely native about it. It's not isolated from global currents, and it's struggling nonetheless to connect in a way that has any kind of meaningful relationship to whatever content they think they might have. So it's kind of an interesting kind of discussion about sacralization of something that's still happening, but it's not the same thing as what we might call strict identification with anything. Like, it's a very content light thing. So that's kind of, you know, I think Rotz provides an interesting way to think about how would we enter into a place and ask, right, what's the religious landscape here? What does it have to do with culture? And he would suggest you could have a surprisingly content-free culture and still have a kind of process in which people are trying to create and approximate a kind of sacralized space and experience. So that's one voice. The other one is a very different text by Jason Josephson. His name keeps changing. Anyway, a colleague of mine up at Williams College. And he's writing out of a religious studies department, and he started off as a Japanese religion guy, but has moved far away from that. And the myth of disenchantment is this kind of second book, and as his introduction states, he's really kind of trying to take the axe to this idea that, well, the West at least is a thoroughly disenchanted secular modernity, and what we're faced with is a kind of mechanistic universe and kind of disbelief is axiomatic and religion is kind of put in this defensive posture, da da da. What I think he pretty convincingly shows, both at a kind of popular level, but also at the level of some surprising kind of intellectuals, these people who were really hyper-rational, scientists and so on. There's this explosion of interest from the 19th century onward in the occult, that disenchantment doesn't really seem to really kind of qualitatively and quantitatively occur in the West. And, one of the questions, he's trying to raise is, if the idea that myth goes away is itself a myth, what is it that we're actually contending with? He himself is not really hostile to the occult and all this stuff. He's kind of interested in it. He thinks it's interesting. And I think it leaves us in a position where how do we really engage with this? This is still a fundamentally different category. So kind of what the conversation that I think is interesting and challenging from a kind of contemporary perspective is you have a lot of competing categorizations, right? Some of them are legal categorizations with obvious consequences. So in some contexts, if you can qualify something as religion, then it's tax exempt, then it's free from certain forms of regulation and interference, but at the price of being constrained to a certain sphere, right? You can't speak, you can't enter into, the kind of political process and so on. But then if you call it spirituality, if you call it something else, then maybe you can enter into public debate and so on and on and on. So I guess I'll stop there and just say, questions, discussions, and then I can just kind of riff on what people have to say. And it can be absolutely nothing to do with the reading. I was just so unfocused.
A neat summary of the two articles.
Skimming over scattered notes here. Number one, I've been in this myth my whole life of modernity. Modernity is a myth.
Yeah.
So my question to myself is, am I just stepping from myth to myth as I travel through life? Maybe I need to be in a myth. I couldn't handle if I, knew otherwise from the same article. In some, I've been arguing that in the hands of both proponents and critics, modernity is a philosophy that comes with a rudimentary narrative structure attached. Every time something specific is termed modern, that implies a story. First there was X, and then everything changed. The word modernity always communicates myth. I'm asking for help. What did the writer mean to get across when he wrote, first there was X, and then everything changed? A philosophy that comes with, that went right over my head, so I'm just asking for a little.
Yeah, I think, he's speaking to a kind of standard, again, a narrative, I think, is a good thing to really focus on here, right? It's like how we tell the story of where we are and how we got here. And so if we go back to the John Butler piece where he was responding to Charles Taylor's, A Secular Age, so whether it's Taylor or Berger, there is this sense that, well, there was a before time and then Copernicus happened, or then Descartes happened, and then suddenly man was the focus of study, or you take your pick, right? And then, what the enchanted, sacred canopy falls off and it's all Newtonian mechanics and and then we're left with this cold mechanism, that kind of before after story. And what JJ and others more increasingly are like, it doesn't seem to really track with what we see when we actually pay attention to what people are writing and doing. But the question is, history happens. It's not, nothing really stays the same, but narratives are narratives. So if some narratives fall away, it doesn't mean they're not replaced by other narratives. And I think it wasn't Kevin Van Hooser who went off on narrative theology. That was kind of like his thing. And so I think it has a kind of consonance with this idea that we can't live outside of narrative, right? So scripture functions often narratively, especially the New Testament and the Gospels. And so it is a kind of, narrative is part of the human condition, and we're in language. And so it's part of the kind of broader linguistic turn that's trying to poke holes at this idea that scientific rationality somehow stands outside of these limitations.
Yeah.
There's a French kind of historian of science named Bruno Latour. And he's kind of really a very seminal figure in science and technology studies. And he's got a great little book called We Have Never Been Modern. And because he writes about scientists are all really, they feel very threatened by this. But it's kind of like sociology of knowledge and so on, so that, science itself, right? If you really, Latour is saying, I'm not a relativist, right? It isn't like it's all just hogwash, but we have to accept the fact that science also operates in a narrative form. So there was a professor in graduate school, he's again a historian of science, and he talked about Isaac Newton. Newton famously, escapes from the city during a plague, and he's out in the country estate, and this is when he does a lot of his research on optics, for example. And he famously writes up the story, as a kind of report for the Royal Society of how he discovers the prism and the light as spectrum. He points out that the way Newton writes the discovery, the narrative of the process is actually entirely false from how he actually discovered it. But the way he wanted to organize it and present it as science was a narrative, right? Uh-huh. And so his point was, even these seemingly, purely empirical rational minds, none of them are able to step outside of the bounds of narrative. So we have to kind of pay attention to that, even as we're talking about historical changes. And so if we say we never step out of narrative, some of the kind of earth-shattering watersheds that were supposedly happened are less watersheds, right? They're less earth-shattering than we might otherwise think.
If you point to a narrative as if you're outside looking in, you're still within a narrative.
I think that's it. I think it's really the myth of modernity is that we're in a position that's the outside looking into something, right? And the key kind of, I think, self-criticism that a lot of academic fields have been undergoing in the last 35, 40 years is recognize. So anthropology is a classic one. So, anthropologists were supposed to be the classic outside looking in, right? We go observe and we see, and then we produce objective analytical knowledge about something, right? Usually a group of people who otherwise can't really know. They have their stories, they have their myths, but we're the ones who are really going to interpret and explain what that's all about. And now, over time, they're like really recognizing that there's something false about that idea that the anthropologist is actually standing outside of anything looking in, right? And then the corollary is that, those who are observed are affected by the fact that they are being observed.
Right.
And therefore, whatever it is you're describing and analyzing is already corrupted by the act of observation, and on and on. So almost all kind of, human sciences, social sciences, and so on, in some ways are doing this kind of navel-gazing evaluation of what is the organizing premise of our entire enterprise. So for religious studies, there's a deep anxiety about whatever in the world is religion, right? No serious scholar of religion thinks there's this thing out there called religion that's easily isolable from other aspects of human enterprise. So then what are they talking about, and so on? So there's a kind of general anxiety about the kind of confidence with which you can step outside any kind of narrative. And again, I don't think it's not this kind of wishy-washy relativism that I think for a while there, postmodernism became this kind of really useless catch-all term, as if people were completely uncommitted to anything. I think it's more a process of people recognizing that there's often a very inescapable layer of ethical commitment to the act of analysis and observation, that this is a process of participating. And so, in anthropology, for example, now they have layers upon layers of human subject research protocols, right? So you have to have a kind of strict ethical compliance consent process and all this stuff to do observational research, right? So that the observer and the observed have an ethical relationship, right? So there's this kind of way in which they're recognizing that knowledge production doesn't occur in some kind of valueless vacuum. So that's a bit of a far riff on it, but that's, I think, the key is what you said, this idea of being outside looking in is really what's under question. And so, whether anybody can confidently say, I don't believe anything, right? I think, JJ and others like him are like, well, we're all in some sense relying on narratives that others might consider mythic to structure our relationship to ourselves and to the world.
That's why I appreciate some of the discussions we've had with Paul, the relationship between story and history in the Gospels and the book of John. They're down to earth. I mean, so many of those stories don't go above the day-to-day living. It raises my appreciation of the narrative aspect. It's just like unfolding the narrative. I appreciate the narrative.
But there is, I think, in Christianity, the acknowledgement that this is a worldview, or this is a narrative, and a kind of self-conscious understanding, or they're supposed to be. Now, whether it always actually works out this way, but I think the idea in Christianity is there's this awareness that the narrative that we're living by is not the predominant narrative of the culture that surrounds us.
Yeah, I think it's the kind of inherent counterculture aspect that's central, right? And I also think, what makes scripture so fascinating is it's also extremely self-aware that it's multi-genred, right? It is a kind of body of writing that is aware that it is using different forms of writing, different forms of narrative in it, which I think is just, I think it's fascinating. And it's, the kind of the old, stereotypical canard about, it contradicts itself. And I'm like, yeah, but can we talk about genre? Can we talk about what's happening inside first before we jump to that easy one? But yeah, I do think it's really, the New Testament is really a call to be out of phase with the world. And, I've felt for a very long time and thought that, one of the greatest kind of stumbling blocks for faithful Christianity is this kind of resentment and defensiveness about being made out of phase with wherever you are, right? That to be a follower of Christ is to put you out of phase. That's what's promised, right? We're not really gonna line up with anything or anywhere we're going to be placed. And yet so much of the kind of, resentment and defensiveness that often arises is, well, why is the world not in sync with what I think it means to be fill in the blank, Christian, American, or, whatever it is. And I think that's often a real friction spot, right? This idea that we're supposed to be a countercultural.
Trent, my question is about the first article.
Yeah.
On the force but isn't Shinto, isn't that part of Shinto doctrine, at least leading up to the pre-war period, that Shinto is so simple and lacking in doctrinal belief that it doesn't even qualify to be a religion. Yeah. It is simply an identity that is too, I'm actually thinking, the guy who wrote, I think I'm quoting somebody here in a newspaper article, who, by the way, was a Christian, but a Christian Shintoist. He's acknowledging, or trying to acknowledge, that Shinto is this kind of ambiguous, unattached national identity. Isn't the forced sort of understanding playing into that?
Again, it's like, it depends on who's asking, right? And so in 1936, there's a Jesuit university in Tokyo, Sophia University. And the way higher education worked in Japan during that period was, if you were enrolled as a student in a recognized institution of higher learning, you were given a reprieve from conscription. And so this was this kind of leverage that the state held over these schools. And so one of the ways they started turning the screws was they would then send reservist army officers to these schools to run drills. They were basically drilling the students at these universities in military drills in exchange for not conscripting. And the schools couldn't really say no, because if they lost that exemption, no students would attend. So in 36, the reserve army officer at this Jesuit university decided he was going to take this class of students to Yasukuni Shrine, which is this modern shrine dedicated to Japan's modern war dead. And so he takes them, and then some of the students who were Catholic refused to bow or refused to go even. And it became a big kerfuffle, and it was kind of an existential threat to this Catholic university that, you're not allowing your students to go to Yasukuni Shrine, you're going to lose your exemption. And the state's attitude was, this is a civic obligation. And the Vatican at the time, so of course, the Archbishop of, Japan writes to Rome, and the Vatican comes back and says, yes, it is a civic right, and they can go. And therefore they went. Now, nobody in their right mind would think that this was not a violation of religious conscience for some of these students, right? But it shows up the kind of fundamental arbitrariness in which these distinctions were made, and whether Shinto was a religion or not. And if we flip back to the other end of the kind of chronology of this, coming into the 18th century, this is before the Meiji Restoration, Shinto shrines and the hereditary priests attached to them had almost a millennia in which they were always subject to Buddhist monastic control. Buddhism controlled Shinto. Shinto was part of Buddhism. And under the kind of Tokugawa rule, everybody who died in Japan had to be buried by a Buddhist monk. The Buddhist parishes kept track of all births, marriages, and deaths. And you had to be buried by a Buddhist, even the Shinto priests. And so the Shinto priests slowly kind of radicalized over the course of the Tokugawa period. And so by the second half of the 18th century, they began clamoring for the right to conduct their own funerals, Shinto funerals. And they start to begin to obsess about, what's the afterlife and what is the theology around Shinto funerary rites. And so when the restoration happens and the new government, it's like, we're going to separate Shinto and Buddhism, a lot of the Shinto priesthood really thought, now we can do our own funerals, and we can actually provide funerals for people, and we can basically replace Buddhism and become the funerary, right? And we can have a more pastoral relationship to people, right? This gets nixed because it's inconvenient for the state that Shinto look like a religion, because now they want to make it all about the emperor, right? And the emperor cannot be a religious figure because the emperor cannot be an object of belief or disbelief. So what's funny is, Shinto becomes this big public civic thing in the early 20th century, but the vast majority of the hereditary Shinto priesthood resent it, because as far as they're concerned, they've been robbed of the richest component of what Shinto could be in the lives of people. Right. So you have this curious phenomenon where Shinto seems ascendant going into World War II, but most of the people most intimately invested in the Shinto shrines, the Shinto priests, are really resentful of how the state is treating them. Right. So what is it? And one more anecdote is, this kind of curious story. A colleague at University of Chicago, Jim Ketlar, universities accumulate all kinds of junk. And so at one point, the archivist says, we've got all these Japan stuff. Can you come take a look at it? And he goes in and he finds all these, they look kind of like ritual things, and, their thing. And he wants to know what this was. And so he starts figuring out that in the very end of the 19th century, there was a gentleman at the University of Chicago who, as far as he knows, wrote the first doctoral dissertation on Shinto outside of Japan. Mm. And this guy could not read or speak a lick of Japanese. But he went to Japan. And as you do at this time, he hires this guy to go around the countryside with him as his interpreter and go visit things Shinto. Okay. And so they went and visited local shrines and, basic pilgrimage sites and so on. And he collects things and he takes a bunch of pictures and so on. And like a good Westerner at the time, he's just opening up what's behind the closed door and what's under the veil and all this stuff. And his dissertation, which was, remember, the first dissertation on Shinto in English. And his argument is Shinto is about the worship of the phallus. Mm. because everywhere he went, he found a stone phallus. Now, in Japan today, most people would be like, what? That's not what Shinto is. So what's going on here? I've got three different data points. So, is Shinto about funerals and the afterlife? Is it about stone phalluses and fertility cults? Or is it a civic ritual of devotion to an imperial state? You take your pick, right? What is Shinto? Nobody knows, right? It was never an independent religion prior to 1868, right? And so on. And so it's a highly contested thing. If you go to Tokyo, in the middle of Tokyo is this very beautiful, large shrine, the Meiji Shrine, that's dedicated to the first modern emperor, Emperor Meiji. Emperor Meiji dies in 1912, okay? So they build this, about the decade after his death to apotheosize him. But of course, what they want to do is make this very modern thing. They've never built a shrine to an emperor before, ironically. It's a very modern idea. And they basically bring in these forest specialists, these arboreal scientists, and they plan a planting of mixed deciduous trees and evergreens and so on, so that as this forest grows, it will mimic an old growth forest. So if you go to Meiji Shrine today, not knowing what you're looking at, but forests, you're going to see this barely 100-year-old forest that looks like it's 400 years old, because it was artificially designed to look like an old growth forest. To me, that's the best explanation of what Shinto is in Japan. It is something that was artificially made to look and feel old. It is an impressive feat, but it is brand spanking new, barely 100 years old.
We Japanese have the Shintoism is an age-old religion arising from the dawn of time. And that's the narrative.
That is there. It's Japan's native religion. But if you go, really, really far back, if you're doing archaeology and early textual stuff, it's like, well, it's very hard to separate whatever this thing that Shinto is from, say, continental shamanism and the introduction of Taoism. It's not whatever it is, it wasn't a pure native thing, right? It was never a pure native thing. But it has to, that's what they want. That's the effect that the kind of powers that be that designed it in the 19th century wanted and needed it to be. And, the Japanese Buddhists played along because, if Shinto was a religion, they'd have to compete with it. But once the state is like, well, Shinto is largely not a religion, then the Buddhists can be like, we're going to do all the pastoral stuff, and we're going to do funerals, and we're going to and we're going to have a much more meaningful relationship to people's lives than Shinto shrines ever will. And the shrine priests really resented that.
And this is, as I understand it, this is what I found interesting in your book, that in the conversations that the Meiji government is having, they're actually debating and constructing this understanding of Shinto, that they're very consciously putting into place something on the order of the British Anglican religion, to play a similar role, that the emperor will be like the king.
Yeah, they are extremely sensitive to the parallels, right? And so this is all happening in the context of unequal treaties. This is happening in the context in which Japan is facing tremendous diplomatic pressure from Christian civilization, right? So the diplomatic representatives of Great Britain and the United States and France and so on frequently invoke this idea that, well, we represent Christian civilization, and therefore you can't outlaw Christianity, and so on and so forth. So they're stuck with this dilemma where, in order to kind of win the recognition of parity from the treaty powers, as they were called, they needed to project a compatibility with Christian civilization, right? Which is this kind of pseudo-racial thing. And so when it came to talking about the emperor, if you roll back in 1871, half of the Japanese government leadership gets on a ship in Yokohama and steams across the Pacific.
visits the United States, and then visits Europe for about 2 years. It's called the Iwakura Embassy. And as they're leaving Yokohama for this trip, they have a conversation on the ship about, well, what will we do when we're asked, what is your religion? Because they're like, Westerners always ask, what's your religion? And this word religion is new to them. And they're like, they feel like they're completely screwed because, well, we can't say we're atheists. We don't believe in anything because they think atheists have no morality. But if we say we're Confucian, then they'll think we're the Chinese. But if we say Buddhist, then that has this problem. We can't say Shinto because they think that's a polytheistic superstition, right? So they don't know what they're going to say, but they recognize that they need an answer to this, right? So they're very sensitive to this. So when they finally get a decade or so later to the point where they're going to draft a constitution, they realize that they want to make sure that the emperor is not a Buddhist monarch, and the emperor is not a Shinto monarch. They don't want him to be a heathen monarch, right? They want him to be as neutral in relationship to Christian monarchs as they can without him being a Christian monarch. There are a few radicals who are like, maybe the emperor should just convert and things would be a lot easier, right? That would make things a whole lot easier. That's just how radical it was, their conversations. But they were very, very explicit to themselves. Like, the way they had this debate was, are we going to make toleration the constitutional principle? Because they look at Europe, and Europe at this time is almost all established religions that tolerate dissent, right? You have the Lutheran Church, you have the Catholic Church, you have the Anglican Church that are established churches, right? With the heads of state, usually the head of the church. But you can be, Victoria is the head of the church, but you can be Methodist, you can be a dissenter, you can be a Quaker, you can be Jewish, right? It tolerates. Or you could do the American Constitution that says you have religious freedom. They choose religious freedom. And the reason they choose religious freedom is because they do not want the Japanese emperor to be seen as a religious figure. They want to disavow that because they don't want to be treated like a heathen country. It's a weird gamble that they do. So the Meiji state is remarkably secular in its self-conception.
But isn't Daijosai?
That's the private ancestral rights of the emperor, right? And shrines that conduct those rituals are not religious anymore. They're like those aren't religion. So those shrines are not, if they're going to do those things, they're not allowed to proselytize. They're not allowed to conduct purification prayers, and they're not allowed to bury people. They're not allowed to behave in ways that the government says those are religion things, right? Hence the strange believability in 1936 for the Vatican to say that's not a religious thing, that's a civic thing. Because by that point, they have 45 years of constitutional precedent in Japan saying that's not religion.
Is the emperor a god?
For most people, no. I mean, that's a bit of a canard. I mean, that idea is whipped up, in the post 1938. Mm-hmm. So what gives that impression is the kind of constitutional principle that they adopt, which is German, is the idea that the monarch must be above partisan fray. The monarch must not be partisan. And therefore, the monarch must be free of the stain of petty partisan concerns. So that's what they meant by a transcendental monarch, right? And it's a European constitutional idea, right? And so there are a lot of ways in which it's by the standards of constitutional arrangements of the day, the Japanese imperial constitution was completely normal. There was nothing really mythical about it. It was very, very straight, standard constitutional structure. There's a kind of American exceptionalist blinders here about this, because a lot of the construction about state Shinto and religious freedom was part of the American occupation during World War II. And there's a way in which the Americans had no clue what was normal in Europe. And so they just assumed what they found on the ground in Japan was super abnormal and weird, when in fact it was completely normal by European standards. America's just weird that way. Its constitutional relationship to religion. I actually think toleration is a much healthier form because it admits that the state is not neutral.
that the state and its legal and customary traditions are rooted in a particular configuration. I think it's more dangerous when, so like French laïcité, French secularism, imagines that the French state is completely neutral in relationship to religion, when a state is never neutral. A state's configurations and laws fit different religions differently. You cannot configure a theologically neutral state. Right.
And that's the tension
because there is no generic religion. There's no such thing as generic religion. Right. Therefore, there is no generic state in relationship to generic religion. It's going to fit differently for different people. Right. So for some, it's, French. So in a weird way, ironically, in France, the Catholic Church is most comfortable in its relationship to French secularism, because it was vis-a-vis the Catholic Church that French secularism formulated itself. But other forms of religion, not so much.
That's the tension that we're in right now.
Yeah.
And
toleration, I think, is just it's more honest. Because if it's toleration, then it's easier to draw the line where a state is in some sense impinging on a person's right to dissent. Absent toleration, that line of dissent becomes blurred, because the premise is the state isn't impinging. Does that make sense?
Well, it's sort of like what the Japanese Christians experienced in Japan, though.
Yeah. So in terms of their fate, it would have been better for them if there had been a state religion in Japan, because then their right to dissent would have had to be overt. Because there is no state religion, they had no right to dissent, because it's not a religion.
And they had to bow to the emperor in church.
Right. Well, they had to bow to the state.
Yeah.
Going back a little bit to the thanks, Trent, for your talk about Shinto. It was really interesting, and I didn't know about conservation as that ethic. It's religious, clearly has some sentiments, but it's not supposed to be religious, but it is, and it strikes me as a parallel with what we have in the North Atlantic. The cross pressure, as Charles Taylor calls it, between Enlightenment as scientific, reductionism would have it, versus the romantic strain of it, or, it's not really counter, it's a separate form of enlightenment that has like environmentalism and spirituality, self-fulfillment, these sorts of things that really spill over or counter, maybe even contradict somewhat that hard scientist approach. So to have that word cross pressure ringing in my ears from Taylor's work is what I've thought of in terms of the Shinto and the romantic, or the conservationist application of it there.
Yeah. It's a usable idea, isn't it? Cross pressures. Yeah, I agree.
Run it down for us. I'm not sure I'm grasping the
cross pressure. Refers to if you have this reductionistic, real technological focused scientific orientation that is the modern spirit that has brought us our technology, that comes from developments in science and Newtonian physics. And Charles Taylor talks about the fact that this is ever present and it's not going away. But at the same time, it's cross-pressured by the romantic impulse, to go out in nature and go, wow, I want to lose myself in this, and I don't want to, dominate the world and cut down the forests. I want to preserve this. But you also want an iPhone, but you also want to preserve the forest. And so there's a good, sort of handle on the cross-pressure that, it's just, we all live in it, and we all maybe land on one side or the other at times, but at some time, and this doesn't necessarily relate. I guess this is the question I should put out there. How does this relate to religion in American and North Atlantic secular cultures? I actually didn't get to read Fitzgerald, but the whole relationship of politics and religion, and what William Cavanaugh called the migration of the holy to the nation state. Our allegiance is to this identity in the absence of, solidified church authority. That definitely civic religion plays in there. And of course, we've got this huge culture clash right now about the authority of civic. What is our civic religion going to consist of? This issue of cross pressure and the romantic and technological strains of enlightenment manifest themselves in whether Japan or, there's probably insights from Japan, I would think. But where is religion in all of that?
I think one way to maybe push it a little further along is like the cross pressure thing is really interesting. So, an anecdote, there's a very famous modern Japanese author named Tanizaki Junichiro, and had a long career. And he wrote this essay. You can get it. It's a real thin little booklet. In English, it's available in English, called In Praise of Shadows. And he goes on about how modern Western architecture with its electric lights and bright painting and, tiled indoor plumbing and bathrooms has destroyed a kind of long-standing Japanese relationship to dark interiors and shadows and natural light coming through paper windows and so on and so forth. And it was this kind of, a kind of ode to something that we used to have but's now being lost. And the kind of semi-apocryphal story is that then one day this Japanese carpenter comes to his house. He says, I read the essay. And he says, I do traditional carpentry. I can build that house for you. And Tanizaki said, no, I couldn't possibly live without indoor plumbing. Right. And so one of the kind of tensions that I think we often confront, even in the realm of religion, and this is something I'm always trying to, it's funny how students sitting in a North American classroom are very tempted. I think it's a weird default where if they're studying and being asked to think about another place in the world, so in this case, Japan, and you're asking them to think about modern history and what its various forms, right? Political, economic, cultural, and so on, and what that does. They think the right answer, the kind of politic answer, is to say, oh, isn't it terrible what modernity did to this place? Surely its happiness and its identity is to go back to something that used to be there, right? A pure, authentic Japaneseness that must have been there. And it's this, I think, this myth, again, going back to narratives, this assumption that there's something, what we want, what we yearn for is a return to what used to be there. But what's weird is that yearning, whatever it is we imagine we want to go back as a solution to the current problem, is itself created by the moment. It's created in the now, right? It never was that. So I think in America, there's this kind of, do something again moment, right? And there's, we used to be fill in the blank about, politics in the public square and civic life and, whatever, take your pick. The solution that's being envisioned, right, is often its own kind of myth, right? It never was that way. And so I do often think, again, it's another version of, we're supposed to be kind of out of phase, so that whatever the solution, the intervention, the kind of the prophetic voice that we're called to have is not nostalgia for something that never was. And it's not a dream for a wholeness that was never promised and was never there in the beginning, right? In politics, there's a way in which I think we're so easily seduced collectively that this, if we just need to go back to a seamlessly sutured time when one's relationship to the political and the economic and all these things were straightforward and whole, when that was just never the case, right? I mean, Israel was forever in exile. And even when it came in from exile, it had a hard time staying home to kind of push the kind of loose metaphor. So I think one of the things we struggle with is, if we talk about these things, yes, there are problems, and we see kind of ways in which the dominant order of things or new arising currents are problematic and alienating and limiting and so on. But how do we
read that, respond to that without at the same time falling for the seduction of thinking there's a wholeness to which we want to return. I think the wholeness is promised, right? We are waiting to be redeemed, right? He will redeem all of this, but we're not there yet, right? But I think there's a way in which we're always hoodwinking ourselves or being hoodwinked into there was once a redeemed wholeness that has now been lost. And I do think that's kind of one of our major struggles as kind of thinking and living biblically in the world today. If that makes sense.
Only we could get back to the 1950s.
Yeah, I mean, or choose your. I mean, for some people, it might be John Donne, right? I mean, you'll take your pick, right? Oh, if only we were in the early 17th century, and it'd be that would have been great. I think we all have a certain kind of. I don't mean to like name call. I think we all have a kind of propensity to a seduction of that would have been great, right? If only I was a Benedictine in the 8th century, then I would have been really cocooned in something that. Take your pick. I think it's as an undergraduate, I was forced to read Jean-Paul Sartre's Nausea. I don't recommend it. But one of the things it stuck with me was, the narrator, the protagonist is part of what he's narrating a relationship that fell apart. And he says, the woman that he had a relationship when they broke, she wanted perfect moments. She wanted perfect moments. And he just couldn't see that, right? So this is the despair. And I always thought this is at perfect moments. It's like in a way we're constantly seduced by perfect moments, right? We think for ourselves, at a very micro level in family relationships, in careers or whatever, we think, oh, if I could just get that perfect moment. And I think it's such a seduction and it's such a stumbling block. And I think we then project it backwards at a macro level into there was once a perfect alignment of X. So there was never a perfect moment in which Japan was perfectly Japanese to the people who lived there as Japanese. Never happened, never existed, right? That had conflict, tensions, divisions, misery, privilege, oppression, divisions, debates, all of those things happening all the time. It's what makes it interesting, right? But the students are always seduced into thinking, well, the correct answer is it was great when Japan was Japan. And I'm like, well, what does that even mean? Right? There was never a moment when it was this thing. And they would do that with all kinds of things. And so in, my class this week, I said, well, how many of you consider yourselves religious? And, out of 17, I had 2 hands, and I'm thinking about what you'd expect, but I'm also thinking they're kidding themselves to think that they're kind of fully out. They just think it's nothing to do with them, right? They're fully free of it. I'm thinking, by the end of the semester, they're usually pretty unhappy because I'm like, good luck with the whole secular thing.
There was never a time when the American colonial settlers, frontiers were at peace with their environment either.
No. And I remember, I can't remember the name of the book, but, there was the whole construction of Native Americans as being perfectly in sync with nature. When the settlers in New England came, they discovered the forests. They periodically burned the forests because that way they'd get more game going through. So they were manipulating the environment all along. Right? They were very smart. They were very technological in their relationship to the environment. And yet the mythos is, well, they were completely in sync and did not act upon nature in any way. And I'm like, well, again, even in the kind of well-meaning attempt, and I think it's a good attempt to kind of bring Native American history and experience into focus, we have to do so by talking about how much political agency and violence they wielded, right? We don't do that by pretending they were some kind of timeless, perfectly synchronized, fully realized cultural entity. No, they had history, and they did things to each other, and they did things to their environment. And that's the way you put them into the story, because that's what it means to have had history. This idea that, the only way we can do justice to these histories is imagining them as these immaculate, aesthetically complete cultures is I think, a real problem, that assumption.
In Europe, there's protests in Germany, I think France, the Netherlands. Farmers are in uproar, in a state of panic. There's legislation being they have to stop growing a certain percentage of their crops. They're not getting subsidized with their diesel fuel. I see it like a triangle. There's the farmers that are panicking and they're in desperation. And then there's an idealization, like a utopian sketch being made of a green earth that because agriculture is dismantling the environment, they're almost like scapegoats. But then on the third part of the triangle, there seems to be power grab. Theologically, it's like we can manipulate the markets. If there's less resources, we can up the prices of fertilizer and so on. It's not congealed, it's not organized. But this idea of a utopia in the past, I just wonder if it might be also moved into the future, but for ulterior purposes. Just the last week, I've been trying to do some research on all these protests in across Germany. They're just farmers just have all the roads blocked with their tractors. They're just really up in arms.
Who is the theologian farmer in Kentucky?
Wendell Berry.
Wendell Berry.
Yeah, that's how I was thinking of. Yeah. Preach it.
That there is kind of this, I always feel that with Wendell Berry. If we could all just become small farmers, like in the 19th century, and return to the earth, that we would achieve a purity that modernity has in some way corrupted and technology has stolen from us. Therefore, we need to throw away our computers. We all need to use manual typewriters and get out there on our tractors and start growing.
No, it's the cross pull you were talking about. I had a friend in college. She grew up on the mission field in Kenya. Her father was a professor at a kind of Bible college there for Kenyan pastors, and she grew up in the Rift Valley. And in college, she was very committed. She wanted to become a doctor and become a medical missionary. And she was always incredibly frustrated with, again, American kind of, alternative medicine. I'm not going to, I'm going to do a home birth. I don't, OBGYN and obstetrics is interventionist. And she's like, these people haven't seen women die in childbirth in Africa for lack of medical care. Right. And if they only knew what modern medicine could do to save these women, And I thought, and to me, it's a nuanced conversation. It's not either or. And yet she had to seek out a medical school in Britain because she wanted to practice medicine in Africa. She had to go to a school that would teach diagnostics without MRIs. Right. So they still teach tropical medicine in Britain. And so in a weird way, she had to kind of go low tech, and I'm sure she would have wished to have MRIs, but you could still practice medicine in a low tech way and so on. And so it's a very nuanced conversation, I think, when we start talking about, technology and medicine and, agricultural production and these kinds of things. It's, one of my grad school professors who was really, critical of kind of this, this modernity narrative and so on. But he was always like, but this isn't about going back. There's no going back. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. There is no going back. And so the question is, if we're being kind of swept along, what are the kind of forms of critique and alteration that we can pursue? That was his kind of way of thinking about it. But I also know scholars that really admit to despair. There is a kind of sense of, what are you going to do? There's a South Asian scholar who's been at Chicago for a long time named Dipesh Chakrabarty, and his big book was Provincializing Europe. Good read if you're interested. But when he first wrote it, he just kind of despaired. There's no escaping this condition for the formerly colonized societies. They will never escape post-coloniality and so on and so forth. And he's just like, I despair. And it's like, ooh, kind of heavy stuff. But yeah,
I have a big question. Trent, you're a Christian teaching history in a secular university. I'm curious then how you see your faith in Christ as mediating, or, what role then for your own faith in a kind of not giving in then, obviously, to the problematic of the myth, but we're surrounded by the myth, the mythologizing. this is kind of this final summing up. I'm curious how your faith plays into it.
Gosh, I don't know. It's been a rough decade. Is my answer. It's been a real rough decade. Yeah, it's been hard. I really don't know. I mean, I think, when I first came here, there was an InterVarsity guy, and his kind of ministry was facilitating kind of faculty level ministry. We have 5 colleges here. There's University of Massachusetts, Amherst College, Hampshire College, Smith College, Mount Holyoke College, all in a consortium. So, he would do these roundtables and would invite outside speakers and try to bring, faculty who were believers and, try to get other people in. And, it was frequently, science and religion was a kind of recurring topic. And I would go, and also kind of fell into this very informal fellowship of, faculty believers in the Valley. And, there's a environmental studies professor, South African Baptist guy, really nice guy, and early English professor, was, Catholic, and myself, and an economist who was Lutheran, and we'd get together, and politics kind of killed it for me. It got really political, and I fell out. I haven't participated in anything like that in a good 5, 6, 7 years now. I sit in the pews of an Episcopal church, and I like the liturgy quite a bit, and I like the Book of Common Prayer a lot. But it can be pretty thin gruel sometimes. So I don't know, I think I'm raising 2 sons, and I was kind of caught out, a little surprised that my oldest, because they were both baptized in the Episcopal Church, but my father baptized them by immersion. They were the only 2 members of this church who were baptized in a horse trough in the columbarium by immersion, and so we were always just a little bit out of sync, out of skew. And I think that's for me. That's just what I'm just trying to do. That I'm just trying to kind of stay just a little bit out of sync and try to get students to budge a little bit from some of their kind of, they're not dug in. I think they're just a little, they've never been given a chance to think about these things. And I think they're afraid of saying the wrong thing. And I feel like most of my job is just getting them to understand the questions and understanding that they can't pretend as if the answers are already there. I teach a first-year seminar called Asia and the European Mind, and it's a really mean seminar because we start with Kant and spend a lot of time with Hegel and so on. But I start with this famous graduation speech that an Amherst alum, David Foster Wallace, gave at Kenyon College. He talks about this cartoon, maybe you've seen it, where there's these 2 young minnows swimming, and then there's a big older fish swimming by, and the older fish says, "How's the water, boys?" And then the 2 minnows look at each other and go, "What's water?" And I say the goal is to learn to see the water and talk about the water. And if I can get students to see the water and talk about the water, then I feel like I'm doing something. And so that's, at this point, that's what I got these days. These days, I'm doing my best not to feel dark, but it's been a gloomy decade, really. Yeah, because I mean, it's like wherever you look, like the academy is under assault. The academy is deemed irrelevant. And the students that do come, we were privileged to have some of the very best students, but they're running scared. And so they don't really want to explore anything. They just want, they don't want to make any mistakes. They just want to get a job. And so getting them to really open up and ask questions is a real challenge. It feels, yeah. Most days I'm very blessed. I'm insanely blessed to be here. So I'm not complaining, but it's gotten harder and harder to answer that question to myself, I guess, is the honest answer.
Oh, I like your answer. Isn't that precisely the naming of the idols, the resistance of reification, the capacity to, in fact, not give ourselves over to the symbolic order, to the law. Isn't that what Christ enables us to do?
Yeah, I try to say basically that, in much simpler terms to my boys, that you shouldn't be afraid. How do you live unafraid is you place the center of your being outside of yourself and in something that undoes you. You're comfortable being undone by Christ. And that's how you should live. But I think it's a lot easier said than done.
And it's always a forward-looking process and movement in which we never settle. The danger is that we always settle into doctrine, into texts, into some reified notion that this thing is a settled thing, when what it means that Christ is a person is that it's continually unsettling.
Yeah.
How old are your sons, and how old are they, and where's Amherst?
We're in Western Massachusetts.
Right. Okay.
So my oldest is 17. He's going to start college in the fall. And my youngest is 15 going on 16. He's a freshman in high school. And we call him a one-man church service because after the pandemic, the church doesn't have a lot of youth. So he does everything. He does the acolyting, it does the lay Eucharistic minister, and does the kiddie chapel in the basement. And, he likes doing all that. It's kind of hilarious. But I keep on telling him, maybe you could become presiding bishop someday. But yeah, it's been exciting. I did not grow up in this church, so it's been kind of interesting too. And there are a lot of, I noticed just a lot of people in the pews are, very few people grew up Episcopalian, and they come from both directions. I think there are a lot of, ex-evangelicals, and there are a whole lot of former Catholics in the pew. So it's kind of an interesting meeting ground. And, my oldest he was a diocesan representative to their national youth convention in Maryland. And that seemed to have been an interesting experience for him. And for a while that when, he was doing the college search, he was like, he went and found Calvin College and Wheaton. And I was like, you could go, but it'll be very different. I didn't want to discourage him, but I thought, talk about a culture shock, but he decided otherwise. So it's been kind of interesting because since I grew up in the mission field, I think my relationship to North American Christianity is very different. It's always been very alien to me. I come from a place where, less than 1% of the population is Christian. So the kind of deep majoritarian assumptions of being Christian just have always felt really unfamiliar, odd to me.
Trent, we really appreciate you doing this.
Well, I'm sorry it's just so scattershot, but it's been a real privilege to hear your thoughts and questions, and I don't know if any of it's useful, but it's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, it's been great meeting you and hearing your research and perspective. And a little bit about your life. So thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you. All right. We'll make it out to Missouri someday, I promise.
We're looking for you. Yeah. You came through.
Maybe when the kids are all out to college, Libby and I will do a road trip.
Were you married when you came? Yeah,
through? We were just married. I think we were driving a U-Haul cross country from Washington to Amherst when we came through Moberly. I'll never forget the little red rose on the inflatable mattress. That was much appreciated.
First class, here in Moberly. Boy, you get some.
Oh, it was great. It was great.
Yeah, that's why you never came back.
No, we're stuck in Western Massachusetts is the boondocks. We're really in the middle of nowhere, so it's a little hard to get out, ironically. So we promise. We've made it to Ohio a few times. We made it that far.
Yeah.
So someday.
Well, we sure appreciate you doing this.
Oh, thank you. And best of luck with the rest of your class time together. I hope it'll be blessed.
Well, now it's going to be, now that you've shined your bright light, they're going to have to endure me.
No. It'll be more organized. So again, thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate you and your questions, and it was very stimulating. So good night to you all.
Okay. Good night.
Forging Plowshares is a community dedicated to cultivating the peaceful kingdom by providing in-depth, transformative biblical and theological education and discipleship. If you have found this podcast valuable, please remember to share on social media. If you have questions about what you've heard, or if you'd like to learn more about how you can get involved with Forging Plowshares or even support this ministry financially, please visit our website, forgingplowshares.org.